In the dense forests of northern Maine, where the trees grow so tightly together that sunlight barely kisses the ground, a story has circulated for decades, told in whispers around campfires, passed between generations of hunters, rangers, and locals who claim the woods remember more than they should. It begins in early November of 1998, when 3 experienced hunters ventured deep into the timberlands outside Moosehead Lake looking for deer before the season closed. None of them expected to find what they did, a cabin that, by all accounts, wasn't supposed to exist. The morning they set out, frost clung to the pine needles like crystal dust, and the air held that dry silence that only comes before snow. Mark Ellison, the oldest of the group, led the way. He'd hunted those woods since he was a boy. Behind him were Ryan Kell, a quiet electrician from Bangor, and Luke Dyer, a former forest ranger turned guide who knew the back trails by heart. Their rifles rested on their shoulders, and the only sounds were boots crunching over frozen leaves and the rhythmic creak of their packs. They followed an old logging road, faded and half swallowed by moss, until midday when the compass began to act strangely, its needle twitching, spinning, never quite settling. Mark frowned at it, tapped the glass, and muttered something about interference. Luke joked about the curse of the North Woods, but his laughter sounded hollow in the cold air. They pressed on, deeper than any of them had ever gone before. By late afternoon, the sun sank low behind the tree line, turning the forest into a tangle of long shadows and icy breath. That's when Ryan saw it. Through the birch trees, maybe 100 yards ahead, a shape too straight to be natural. "Hey," he said softly, pointing. "You see that?" At first, Mark thought it was just an old hunting blind, maybe a forgotten ranger station from decades ago. But as they drew closer, their unease grew. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't even old. The cabin stood clean and solid, its walls built of fresh cedar logs, roof sloped neatly, and a chimney rising without a hint of smoke. No trail led to it, no signs of tire tracks or footprints. Just a structure sitting dead center in untouched wilderness, as if it had appeared overnight. The hunters circled it cautiously. The front door was shut, but the windows, each perfectly square, were dark, showing nothing inside. There was no sound, no movement, only the faint whistle of wind through the branches. Luke ran a gloved hand along the logs. "This wood's new," he said quietly. "No rot, no moss, no wear." He turned the handle. It opened easily. The smell that drifted out was faintly metallic, mixed with something sweet and sour, like old blood and rotting fruit. Inside, the air was still and heavy. Dust covered everything, yet the furniture, 2 chairs, a small table, a bed, looked untouched. There were no personal items, no photos, no clothes. Just a single lantern on the table, and beside it, a journal. Mark opened it. The pages were filled with tight, uneven handwriting. At first, it seemed like a logbook, a list of dates, weather notes, hunting results, but as they read further, the tone shifted. The entries became fragmented, desperate. Words like voices, the woods moving, eyes at the window. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1953, 45 years earlier. Ryan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "This can't be right," he said. "This place wasn't here before. I've hunted this stretch for 10 years. Mark closed the book and looked around the room. There were no spiderwebs, no signs of animals nesting. The wood stove was spotless, the bed perfectly made, and yet everything felt wrong. The shadows didn't move right, they seemed thicker, darker, stretching toward them whenever the light shifted. They decided to leave, but as they stepped outside, the forest looked different. The trees seemed closer, the path they'd come from less clear. The air had grown colder, unnaturally so. A fog had begun to rise from the ground, curling between the trunks like pale fingers. Luke pulled out his compass again, but now the needle spun in violent circles. "Something's off," he said, his voice low. Then they heard it, a sound faint and distant at first. A rhythmic thump, like footsteps echoing through the fog. Slow, heavy, measured, coming closer. They stood still, listening, hearts pounding. Mark raised his rifle. "Probably a deer," he whispered, though his voice trembled. The footsteps stopped. Then, from behind the cabin, a whisper floated through the air. Soft, almost human. It said one word. "Stay." The 3 men froze. Luke swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam hit nothing. Just fog. And then, suddenly, all at once, the forest erupted into noise. The trees groaning, the wind howling, and from deep within the mist, something began to move. They couldn't see it, only hear it. A scraping, dragging sound circling them, faster and faster. They ran. Through the fog, through the black maze of trees, stumbling over roots and rocks. Mark led, the journal still clutched in his hand. Behind them, the sounds grew louder, closer, like whatever was there wanted them to know it wasn't far. At one point, Ryan glanced back and swore he saw a shape in the fog, tall, human-like, watching. After what felt like hours, they burst through the trees and found themselves back on the old logging road. The fog stopped there, as if it refused to cross. They didn't stop running until they reached their truck, breathless, shaken, their clothes torn and muddy. When they looked back toward the woods, the fog was gone. The forest was silent again. 2 days later, Mark returned with 2 rangers to show them the cabin. They followed the same route, retraced the GPS coordinates he'd he'd marked, but there was nothing there. No cabin, no clearing, not even disturbed soil. The forest floor was seamless, untouched, as if nothing had ever stood there. The rangers were skeptical, but Mark insisted. He showed them the journal. They examined it carefully. The pages looked aged, the ink faded, the dates still clear. But when they tried to verify the name written on the first page, Henry L. Warden, there was no record of any such person in state archives, land registries, or census data. The handwriting, they said, looked too consistent for something supposedly written in the 1950s. Over time, locals began to talk. Some said the cabin was an old ranger post built before the war, forgotten and swallowed by the woods. Others believed it was part of something older, connected to the Penobscot legends of the Spirit House, a place said to appear in the forest when someone trespasses too deeply into sacred ground. According to the stories, those who enter the cabin never truly leave. A part of them stays behind, repeating the same moments forever, waiting for the next traveler to wander too far. Mark never hunted again after that. He kept the journal locked in a safe, and sometimes, late at night, he claimed he could hear tapping from inside it, like fingernails against wood. Ryan moved away, leaving Maine altogether. Luke stayed, but he stopped guiding hunts. He said once that sometimes, when the fog rolled down from the hills, he could see the outline of that cabin again, just faintly, before it vanished into the mist. To this day, the story of the cabin circulates around the logging towns and ranger stations of northern Maine. Some dismiss it as a campfire tale, a mix of frostbite, exhaustion, and overactive imagination. But others, especially the old hunters who know the sound of every tree, every animal in those woods, say they've seen it too. Not often, not for long, just enough to know that something in those forests remembers. Because the woods are older than any map, older than any man, and sometimes they build their own walls. In the months following their discovery, the three hunters tried to move on with their lives. But Maine's winters are long, and silence leaves room for thoughts that won't die. By December, Mark Ellison's wife noticed he'd stopped sleeping through the night. She'd find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that old leather-bound journal, the one that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Sometimes he'd be mumbling, whispering under his breath like he was trying to recite something he couldn't quite remember. When spring came, he tried to convince himself it had all been a trick of the light, a collective hallucination brought on by fatigue and fear. Yet every time he thought of the cabin, the shape of it, the weight of the silence inside, he felt a heaviness in his chest, as though the woods themselves had marked him somehow. Ryan Kell fared worse. His friends said he'd become paranoid, refusing to camp or even walk near wooded areas. He stopped answering calls from Mark and Luke altogether. In March of the following year, his girlfriend found him standing in the middle of their backyard, barefoot in the snow, muttering that the lights were back. He claimed he saw them flickering in the trees, pale yellow glows moving in patterns too deliberate to be fireflies. She took him to a doctor. The diagnosis: severe sleep deprivation, anxiety, possible PTSD. Luke Dyer, the one who'd spent his life guiding others through those forests, tried to make sense of it the way any rational man would. He returned to the area several times that spring, armed with his old ranger maps, a metal detector, and a 35mm camera. He followed the same coordinates, measured distances, and marked tree lines, but each trip led him back to the same conclusion. There was no clearing, no evidence of a structure, no indication anything had ever stood there. And yet, the deeper he went, the more he felt watched. On his third trip, Luke brought a small digital recorder. He wanted proof, audio evidence, something that might validate what they'd seen. He spent the entire day combing through the underbrush, setting markers, and reading his compass aloud into the recorder. When he got home that night, he played the audio back. For the first 15 minutes, it was nothing but wind and his own breathing. Then, faintly, underneath the crunch of his boots, came a low hum. It lasted less than 10 seconds, but it was there. A sound like a deep exhale, followed by a whisper that seemed to echo from behind the microphone. It said, unmistakably, "You came back." Luke told no one for months. He stored the recorder in his basement and locked the door. But when the whispers began creeping into his sleep, soft murmurs that sounded exactly like the ones he'd heard in that cabin, he finally broke down and called Mark. The two met at a diner off Route 15. Mark was thinner now, eyes sunken, skin pale. He brought the journal with him, wrapped in cloth. Luke played the recording for him right there in the booth. When the whisper came through, Mark went rigid. Slowly, he opened the journal, flipping to the last page, the one dated October 31st, 1953. Beneath the final entry, in fresh ink, was a single new line. "You came back." The men sat in silence for nearly a minute before Mark said, "I burned this." His voice was shaking. "After that night, I burned it in the fire pit behind my house." Luke didn't know what to say. The ink wasn't smeared or faded. It was clean, fresh, as though written that very morning. He reached out to touch the page, but as soon as his fingers brushed the paper, the lights in the diner flickered. Just once. Nobody else seemed to notice. That was the last time Mark Ellison was seen alive. 2 weeks later, his truck was was found abandoned off a service road near the same stretch of forest. The doors were unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Search parties combed the woods for days, even bringing in dogs and helicopters. But there was no trace, no tracks, no clothing, nothing. The only thing found was his rifle, propped neatly against a pine tree, barrel pointed toward the sky. Luke withdrew from the search after the third day. He said the moment he stepped past the tree line, the air changed. It smelled like cedar again, just like the cabin. That night, as the searchlight swept across the forest, someone reported seeing a faint orange glow deep in the trees, like the flicker of a lantern. The next morning, the glow was gone. Over the following years, reports continued to trickle in. Hikers, hunters, even a group of college students claiming to have seen a house in the woods that disappeared when they tried to approach it. Every description matched perfectly. The same cedar walls, the same single window, the same stillness. Local law enforcement dismissed it as a regional legend, fueled by folklore and fear. But those who knew the area best, the rangers, the guides, the hunters, avoided that part of the forest altogether. The legend of the Vanishing Cabin soon took on a life of its own. Some said it was a remnant of an old colonial homestead, cursed after a massacre during the French and Indian War. Others tied it to Wabanaki folklore, the tale of Kolaptek, a forest spirit said to mimic human structures to lure wanderers away from their path. In those stories, the spirit built houses without history, places that seemed safe but led those who entered into another realm, one where time forgot to move. In 2015, a local documentary filmmaker named Aaron Myers decided to investigate. He'd grown up hearing stories of the cabin and wanted to prove it was nothing more than superstition. He interviewed Luke Dyer, now an old man with trembling hands, who told him everything, including the part about the whisper on the recorder. When Aaron asked to hear it, Luke hesitated, then agreed to retrieve it from his basement. 2 days later, Aaron went to Luke's home. The front door was open. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints, but the basement door was wide open, and at the bottom of the stairs sat Luke's tape recorder, still running. The audio captured 12 hours of silence, except for the last 30 seconds. A door creaks open, footsteps, then a voice, calm, familiar. "You came back?" Aaron turned the recording over to police, but they could find no explanation. Luke's disappearance remains unsolved to this day. The Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife later sealed off that section of forest, citing unstable ground and sinkhole risk. But locals say that's just the cover story. Sometimes, on misty nights, campers near Moosehead Lake report seeing a soft orange light flickering through the trees. When they try to follow it, it always vanishes. And yet, those who get close enough swear they can smell cedar and hear, faintly, a heartbeat that isn't their own. The story endures not because of the fear it brings, but because of what it says about the wilderness itself. There are places in this world untouched by time, where memory and reality blur, where something ancient watches quietly from behind the veil. Maybe it isn't a ghost or a curse. Maybe it's the forest protecting itself, reminding us that we were never its masters, only visitors who stayed too long. And somewhere out there, beneath the shadow of those pines, stands a cabin waiting for the next soul curious enough to find it. When they do, the door will be unlocked, the lantern will be burning, and on the table, a journal will lie open to a fresh page, ready for a new hand to write the next name. Because the woods never forget, they only wait.